Hey Brewer Middle School Trumpets, we're on to the next etude, the Lyrical Etude for Region 30. So this etude is not, when I played it through and read it through, it wasn't my favorite lyrical etude because there's not as many longer notes as you might think in a lyrical etude that, a lyrical etude might have. So it's going to be a little trickier to try and play lyrically, play pretty, play like a lyrical etude should sound. But that doesn't mean you can't do it. Now this etude's slightly slower from quarter note equals 76 through 88 beats per minute. So it's a little bit slower. The first thing you want to do when practicing this etude in particular is because it's slower, it may take you a little more time. I like to divide it into three parts. So I have my first division being measure 1 through measure 8, the next division being measure 9 through measure 16, and then the last one being the odd tempo, measure 17 through the end, through 26. I divided this etude into thirds, mainly being that it's a little easier to practice it that way, and you can do that with the last etude as well. Not necessarily into thirds, maybe into halves or quarters, but just find a way to divide these etudes in a way that helps you practice in a more efficient manner, in a more disciplined manner. Good. So divide the etude into thirds, like I mentioned. 1 through 8, measures 1 through 8 being the first, measure 9 through 16 being the second, and 17 through 26 being the third. So pay attention to accidentals in this etude, as there's a lot of B flats, there's a lot of A flats, but they make sense. And it's like in the last etude that I mentioned, the accidentals in those measures. Play these with confidence. They're there for a reason. They create interest and thought for the listener. So it's important that you play them with confidence. And be confident about where you're playing them and how you sound on them. The B flat and the A flat accidentals. Slur 2 tongue 2 is also prevalent in this etude. There's a little difference. There's variation in the eighth notes in this rhythm, or in this etude. However, you do still have 8th note, 16th note combinations that are also slurred. So the 16th notes in these 8th note, 16th combinations will be slurred as well, usually into the next note that precedes it or the next rhythm that precedes it. In measures 9 through 12, this is going to be the trickiest part it might be the trickiest part for the etude, doesn't have to be, but the trickiest for articulation for sure. So there's some slight variance with the measures, with measures 9 through 12, in that there's constant 8th notes. They're not all tongued and they're not all slurred. Most of the time, yes, so in these measures, the first 3 8th notes of each grouping of 4 8th notes is slurred. So it'll be slur 3, tongue 1, really. And then you'll articulate the next grouping, the next 3 8th notes in the next grouping. Or you'll start with articulation, slur the next 3, and then tongue the last one. So you'll hear it in the recording. It's a little tricky to get at first, but you'll hear it in the recording that it should stay consistent and it should match what it sounds, what it reads. The only thing that's different is in measure 11, you have the second grouping of 4 8th notes. The last 3 8th notes of that are slurred. Whereas before, in the 2 measures preceded by it, measure 11, the first 3 8th notes were slurred. So make sure that the last 3 8th notes of the last grouping of 8th notes are slurred in measure 11. I mentioned the 8th 16ths. The 16ths on the 8th 16ths should be slurred as well. So phrasing, the next thing we'll move on to is phrasing. Phrasing in this piece is definitely guided by the range as well as dynamics, but it's really easy to tell that the higher you go in this etude is where kind of the interest lies, or it's sort of in the middle of the phrasing. So if you'll reference to measures 1 through 8, the peak of this phrase, very long phrase, is, in my opinion, between measures 4 and 5. And that's the highest point that you go. You don't go any higher than C. And after measure 5, introduces measure 6 and 7 with the B flats and the A flat, excuse me. And the range kind of goes down as you progress through that phrase. And the last part of that phrase is measure 8, and that's the lowest point. So definitely make sure that you know range. The highest note you have in here, I believe, is an E, and it's in measure 13, and it's also in the beginning, or in the middle of the phrase from measure 9 through 16. So follow the contour of this etude, especially when you're working with your dynamics. Dynamics will help your phrasing, just like I mentioned in the first one, but it'll help your audience hear where you intend on your phrasing to be. Dynamics mark your intention and how you play music. So if you're at measure 9 and you start piano, or if you're at measure 9 and you start forte, and you want to grow from there because there's a crescendo at 10, by the time you get to measure 12, you'll already be at forte, so you have nowhere to go. You could try playing even louder, but that would be kind of uncomfortable for your audience to hear. So make sure you start piano at measure 9. This is what we talk about with exaggerating dynamics. This is key when playing lyrically and technically, but especially lyrically. You're always trying to make music in what you play. And crescendos with the contour. So if you go a little higher in the range, you might want to crescendo accordingly to that, and decrescendo when you go down accordingly. So only slight ritardando at 15. It's marked in the music. I think the bigger ritardando should be at 25, but it's also marked molto ritardando, which means slight ritardando. So don't ever overdo it. We don't want to feel like we're dragging through the phrase. Just enough to create a little bit of a anticipation for the end. Yeah, the biggest one's got to be at 25. So if you make the one at 15 small, you have to make the one at 25 at the very end of the piece a little bit longer. Just a little bit slower with the ritardando and how you slow down, but not overdone. And the A16s in this rhythm, like I mentioned, or in this etude, like I mentioned, are key. When we're playing lyrical etudes, we look for long notes and we look for half notes and a lot of white notes on the page, whereas we have a lot of black ink in this etude. There's a lot of notes, there's a lot of rhythms, so rhythm is very important. If I could give you a big sum up to both of these etudes, your rhythm and how you read it is very important, and the articulations that play into those rhythms are very important. So spend a lot of time with those and your rhythm building exercises and articulation studies that Ms. Johnson gave you. Once again, that's a wrap up for etude breakdown. I wish you all the best of luck during your audition process. Do your best to be comfortable. Do what you can to be comfortable in the room. Don't stress. Everyone is going to be equally nervous. So just make sure you play how you know how to play with confidence, and you will do well. So good luck to you all.